So thank you all for joining us. Again, we're going to get started in just a couple minutes for our monthly Facts and Snacks webinar. And if you would like to introduce yourselves, please type your name, your pronouns, your organization into the chat box, and go ahead and select all panelists and attendees so that everybody will be able to see that if you would like to share. That'll also be helpful for throughout the presentation. If you'd like to use the chat box to ask a question, that way everybody will be able to see it. If you don't feel comfortable with that, just know that we will read the questions aloud when they are asked in the chat and make sure everybody hears the question before it gets answered. So we'll get started in just a minute. Welcome to those of you who are just joining us. Thanks for hopping on to our monthly Facts and Snacks webinar. We're glad that you're here. We are recording this webinar, and if you would like to introduce yourself, feel free to do so in the chat. If you'd like to put your name, your pronouns, your organization. If you'd like to share that with everybody, please feel free to select all panelists and attendees. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have a question throughout the webinar, feel free to type that into the chat as well. If you don't feel comfortable sharing that out, you can give that information to just us as panelists, and we will make sure that we read questions aloud when they come in. So thank you all for being here, and we'll give it just another minute and get started. And before we get started, I just want to let you all know, if you would like to use the closed captioning, there is a button at the bottom with a CC on it, says live transcript. Feel free to click on that and it'll give you some options for subtitles. Feel free to use that if it's helpful. And also, again, if you have questions or any kind of technical funkiness that comes up, feel free to type that in the chat and we'll take care of that as well. Again, thank you for being here for our monthly Facts and Snacks webinar, and we are going to talk about economic justice, and I'm going to throw it over to our housing and economic justice team, Lindsay and Chance. They are going to go ahead and introduce themselves and get us started. And again, feel free to type any questions in the chat and select all panelists and attendees when you want to do that, if you're able to. And I'm going to do one quick plug at the end. We're going to share out some announcements. So I know sometimes we might want to taper off really quickly at the end. Just want to let you know we do have some announcements, so maybe hang on till the end for that so we can make sure you hear all the good stuff. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chance LeBeau. I use he and they pronouns. I am the Housing and Economic Justice Specialist at Violence Free Colorado. Lindsay is on the call with me as well today. And thank you, Brandy, for introducing us. I'm here to talk through economic justice and introducing you all to our new pocket guide that we rolled out, I'd say about a month ago. So I'm just going to introduce you to that. We're going to get you all some access to that and then walk through kind of where we started out writing it and kind of what we're hoping you all can gain from it through this and future conversations we hope to have with you all. Generally speaking, as a housing team, we run things pretty lackadaisical, I would say. And so if you have questions, feel free to ask them in the chat as they come up, and I'm happy to pause and answer them as you need, just to make sure that folks get their questions answered in the moment. So with that, I think I'll jump right in. Unless, Lindsay, do you have anything else to add?
I do not have anything else to add. I'm Lindsay Christopher. I'm the Housing Program Manager at Violence Free Colorado. Chance will be leading us through this conversation. I will be dropping some links into the chat. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and do that as soon as I mute myself. I'll be providing a link to the Economic Justice Pocket Guide, to the digital version. So go ahead and kick us off, Chance. I'm going to drop that link in the chat.
All right, thank you, Lindsay. And so just to start us off, again, here's the link. And today we'll be going through the Pocket Guide, which we developed as a means of enhancing existing financial literacy resources. There are a number of them out there, and Lindsay and I spent a couple years just kind of tapping into ones that looked at behavioral components to economic justice, abuse in finances through things like the all-state curriculum. We also just attended a lot of economic justice and social justice related professional development that really geared us toward how do we bring more economic justice into what already exists. And so with that being said, again, this is meant to enhance and identify experiences of financial abuse, establish and support work towards survivor-driven financial goals, and connect survivors with appropriate resources in your communities. In the appendix, we also have a number of tools that we utilized to create some of these materials, as well as other materials that we will be introducing in future conversations with regard to how to implement some of these resources and how to really, plug in where it makes a lot of sense. And so I think Lindsay's dropped the text or dropped the link to that in the chat box over here. And there's a link here, so I think you'll have access to this PowerPoint after as well. And so with regard to all of that and how and what the Pocket Guide is for, the main framework that Lindsay and I wanted to really highlight through what we learned across the board with economic justice is the connection between trauma and finances. And how trauma, we know, impacts a lot of different things within a person's life, specific to money. It's where and how people spend their money, feel they have to spend their money, are forced into as a result of life situations, their ability to budget effectively, and make short and long-term financial goals. So all of these things are kind of connected, again, with regard to what we know about trauma and how it affects our ability to focus in on long-term and short-term goals and what that specifically might mean for financial goals survivors may have. From the outside, it may look like the survivor is choosing to make poor financial decisions. And again, in reality, we know that survivors' brains may be more focused on physical and emotional safety during crisis as a result of trauma. And it's really important as we enter into these conversations that advocates do not pass judgment on survivors' spending habits. At times it may appear survivors choosing not to make informed decisions about their finances. And again, just relating it back to the point above, is that there are other concerns, there are other perhaps more pressing or immediate needs that a survivor needs to be able to be in the mental capacity to make some long-term decisions. And finally, advocates may work with survivors to identify if their spending habits are misaligned with their values. But the really important thing about this conversation is kind of everything that's been explained above and will be explained throughout. Messages survivors receive around their finances and their money and their spending are not exclusive to survivors. And so it's also really important that advocates unpack their own relationship to their own finances and money and are very honest with themselves around understanding why it might be hard for survivors to open up around these things, especially if we ourselves are not also very comfortable approaching them. And so ultimately that just gives us a little more empathy. And so moving into today's presentation, and what we hope you kind of walk away with is we really just want to enhance existing programming, resources, and tools that support the economic stability and empowerment of survivors. The three ways we're going to kind of do this is through being able to identify and discuss abuse with survivors. Outcome number two is broadening our understanding of economic justice advocacy, and so really just unpacking and blowing up the idea of what we're considering to be economic justice advocacy. And with those first two in mind, then we are able to differentiate between what financial stability is and why that's important, and then what is kind of the next step as far as economic justice and economic empowerment for survivors. And so just looking at the different levels around supporting survivors, their needs and their goals, depending on where you're meeting them at any given point. So moving into the first outcome here is being able to identify financial abuse. And what we know is, what has been reported is that 99% of survivors of domestic violence experience some form of financial abuse in which the person causing them harm controls their finances. At the same time, not everyone, including survivors, recognize financial or economic abuse as an element of domestic violence. This is usually related to cultural and societal messages around finances and money. And so you can think of this around like shared income, who makes decisions with finances and money, how that power and control might be exhibited in those relationships. Again, because these things like domestic violence happen behind closed doors, they're seen as private. We don't usually openly discuss money and finances. There's a lot of reasons financial abuse may not even be recognized at first. And so because of its experiences, survivors may think it's typical for one partner to be in charge of finances. They may not see the connections between power and control. And that also to be said that while some things may look problematic or seem problematic, maybe they are part of a larger discussion. And so we'll kind of get into some of that as well later on. A big piece of how we will be doing this is by centering survivors, as we try to and should be doing with everything we're doing. And so in centering survivors, financial goals are determined and defined by survivors. And this means that financial stability, which we will define and unpack in a moment, can have many different definitions on its own. And from there, because financial stability and financial goals are going to be different, financial safety planning is also going to look different survivor to survivor. And so throughout this presentation and many of the discussions we'll be having at Violence Free Colorado around economic justice and financial stability, the definition we've kind of landed on for financial stability is the consideration of what is needed for a survivor to move from crisis towards safety. Very specifically by addressing some of those immediate needs, right? What we know, food, shelter, safety, how those things intersect, what else might be needed. And so, sorry, I just lost my place for a moment. Oh, addressing immediate needs. And so this is kind of where financial stability and the bar for that is set, is what resources will be needed to get folks out of crisis, which sounds a little strange to say, but again, more towards safety and more toward a stable spot by addressing immediate needs that may not be met in the moment. And so, again, in order to in order to talk about financial abuse, we have to be able to identify a financial abuse. And so these are some examples of intake questions for screening as folks come in, to be able to see if there are elements of financial abuse happening, coming up, if a survivor has experienced it. And so kind of from a large to smallish way, it's more around like, can they make that connection? Are they already able to see if there's something related to their experiences of domestic violence and their financial stability? Again, just discussing openly and honestly how financial situations may be in flux right now as a result of the domestic violence or what's going on. Again, unpacking having access to money when it's needed, and not just money specifically, but all forms of resource, income, ways that survivors would be able to make decisions for themselves and empower themselves to do things, and do have the ability to make choices and decisions about career, employment, or education. And so again, power and control, where does it come up? How does that look? And so in identifying financial abuse, it's helpful to include some of these screening questions, and there's more. We have a couple different documents, and we'll get into how you'll be able to access those as we go through the presentation. And the goal of these questions is to identify if survivor has power and control over their own finances. Mainly, are they able to access their funds if they want to, or have a specific need, or does their partner maintain access to money? And when we start with these questions, the goal is to be able to identify experiences of financial abuse in areas that they need support. Advocates can better get an understanding of what support and resources may be needed, and to get using this to set financial goals. And the really big piece about identifying financial abuse is the questions utilized in the previous slide, and I'll just go back for a moment, are really meant to be conversation starters, right? And so even with something around like access to money when you need it, you know, that could look different household to household. What does access mean? Is there a working agreement? Are folks able to know where their money goes and how to get a hold of it? And maybe they don't immediately know how to do it, but are they able to? And are their partners open and honest with them about it, right? And so just starting the conversations to identify if financial abuse is even there, and if it is, beginning to make those connections for yourself and with survivors. And so from there, deepening economic justice advocacy is kind of where we move, right? As we've identified it, we're talking about it with survivors. And so then how do you support survivors through that specific aspect of their safety and movement towards safety? And so organizations may continue to work more deeply on financial goals if there are advocates specifically doing economic justice work within the organization. Little asterisk here is to identify who in your organization already has close connections to economic justice advocacy. And that'll come up next in broadening the understanding of economic justice. But this will be important as to, like, once we're able to identify with survivors, who then is able to work more specifically, do some deep dives, assist survivors in navigating what that might mean. And ultimately, capacity, we know, is an issue across the state, in every organization, all the time. And so understanding where needs that survivors have and where barriers may be, and being able to notice those gaps in services to identify engaging and necessary community partners to work with in the future, or at least even in some instances begin working with now. So that was part one. I just want to pause for a few moments just to let folks maybe catch up and see if there's any questions, but if not, we'll also just keep trudging along here. Alrighty, I'm not seeing anything light up on my chat side of things. So again, if you have questions throughout, also feel free to ask them in the chat, and Lindsay will flag me and let me know what they are, and we can jump right in if you need. So a broader understanding of economic justice advocacy. Oops, gotta get back on the right presentation. What is economic justice advocacy? Economic justice advocacy may include housing access, food access, education, transportation, language, basically anything you can put in front of the word access. And the reason I left it open is in the next slide, I have an example here of how each one of those categories can break out into so many other subcategories and sub-subcategories. And when you start to break them down, you can also start to make connections to where the economic justice components bridge these things together. And so under housing access, we have things like shelter, rental assistance, eviction defense, rent prices, housing protections, landlord engagement. We can go down the list of what housing advocates do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Then there's food access, right? And we have food prices, food deserts, food assistance programs. Again, I was just kind of grabbing some low-hanging fruit around things that we kind of think of immediately with what it means to get food access. And under the subpoints, one of the things I meant with rent prices and food prices was livable wage. And so we start to draw those connections around, yes, we're talking about rent and rent advocacy and renters rights, but also there is this common understanding that with livable wages, those rent prices can kind of be whatever, as long as we're able to adapt to that. Same with food prices, right? If we're able to actually give people the amount it takes to live in the area that they're working and living, then they're able to actually do these. And so there's these advocacy aspects of where they branch and where they intersect. And so by broadening our understanding of economic justice advocacy, we're able to make better connections to where it's already happening in our organization, even if we're not already calling it that. And so this looks at access to resources as well. And so it's important that advocates not only learn to recognize, understand, and support survivors in navigating systemic barriers, but also looking at organizational programming does not replicate or create new barriers for survivors. And so this is just really looking at a need to assess barriers to services and resources that might be created by policies, practices, or even work habits. And again, this just looks at, are we doing the most we can to make things as low barrier for survivors to get involved and really get on their way towards safety. And flexible funding provides more funds to go directly to survivors to meet their self-determined needs. Again, we all love and are always looking for more flexible funding, but the more involved we get in economic justice, and again, looking at that idea that this is so defined and centered around survivors' definitions of what that means for them, the more flexible that funding can be in the future, it's going to ultimately support this goal a lot better. And so with that, we kind of go into financial safety planning, which is again looking at kind of what we're already doing internally. How do we set safety plan with survivors that are experiencing financial abuse? So again, once we've identified that this is happening, how do we bring this conversation into some of the work we're already doing? Safety planning is a big part. It happens throughout. We know how to do that. And so one of the considerations here is, again, are there elements to your safety planning that are already connected to economic justice? What I think a lot about is access to money, access to important documents, access to banks, access to checking accounts, and those sorts of things become parts of safety planning that have always been there. But again, when we have this lens, we're then able to dive a little deeper on what those needs might mean and how to meet them. And after financial abuse is identified, it's really helpful to work further with survivors toward financial stability. So again, not just toward like what's needed in the moment, but again, knowing that long-term financial stability is kind of going to need to be there so that they can exit crisis, so that they can, begin to work through trauma. That's kind of the long-term goal here. And so this is a good time to begin setting short-term and long-term financial goals with survivors. And so we'll move into the third part here shortly. Again, I want to give another moment for any questions that have come up in the chat or any questions you might have around what's been shared already. Alrighty, so we'll just move into financial stability and economic empowerment. And so if we look at what we just addressed with what is financial stability and what that means as far as meeting immediate needs and setting goals, when trying to get toward financial stability, we want to include the safety planning to make sure that folks are going to be able to have what they need. Creating short and long-term plans, right? And so again, this looks at maybe crisis, immediate needs, getting those met sooner rather than later, and also as crisis begins to settle down, what is the long-term? And throughout the process of setting financial goals, always keeping in mind that trauma and spending element that we addressed from the beginning, trauma and finances, where folks are spending their money where they feel they're needing to get their needs met, and not looking at that through judgment, but also helping folks to see where their values may be and how they can continue to support those values and goals for themselves. And so considerations to financial stability include the financial safety planning, safe and stable housing, food security, livable wages, language access, as mentioned, survivor to survivor, experience to experience. This is going to change and alter depending on what point a survivor is coming in at and where they are. But as we begin to meet some of those more immediate needs, like making sure that folks have food, making sure that folks have safe and stable housing, are they able to, if not a livable wage, make enough to have their needs met? What does that look like and mean? Again, looking at additional resources, are we tapping into everything we can to support these survivors? And so as those needs get met over time, we begin to shift from financial stability into hopefully economic empowerment work. And so economic empowerment work really looks at what does economic justice advocacy look like as the survivor begins to exit crisis and or restabilize. As always, it continues to be survivor-centered and survivor-defined. And so like an element of this that often comes up is a critique around like how much money a survivor or any person should have in their savings account in order to be safe, secure, all the things. And we know that like, yes, statistically, a $2,000 put away for a rainy day is really helpful. We also know that many survivors, because of a lack of livable wages, because of a lack of resource, because of exposure connection, other things like that, that may not be as necessary or as important to any one survivor at any given point in time. And so again, making sure that economic empowerment is defined by survivors and ultimately focusing on that question of what happens after crisis. And so utilizing tools to support economic empowerment. It's important to remember that tools that we have, whether they're budgets, whether they're curriculums, whether they're activities and exercises, are meant to support a survivor's economic goals, not to create them and not to be the goal itself. And so the best example that we have often identified is in every housing, economic justice, anyone kind of related to this work right now can talk about how budgets often come up as like this grand save all for like, if you just budget your way out of poverty, you'll be great. And ultimately, a budget is to be looked at as a tool toward achieving a financial goal. And so they may be used to further set saving goals, gaps in resources, or even perhaps a survivor wants a better understanding or to visualize where their resources are. The budget should assist in that larger goal and outcome, but should not be the outcome itself. And so that's just the most important piece around working through the economic justice curriculum and resources that are out there at plenty, is just understanding that they are tools meant to support that goal. And we can't just look at the budget as the checklist to say we've done economic justice or empowerment work. And so with that is kind of what's next for us, for y'all, if you're interested in continuing on this discussion and this journey, is implementation. And so what's next? And so those are some of those intake resources. Again, how do you build those things in? Who in your organizations are already doing a lot of this work, and how do you bridge those connections and support them to build out some of this? And then on the other side, deepening economic justice advocacy, identifying community barriers, identifying community partners. Again, if our organization is not able to specifically help a survivor on any one thing, who else in our communities are able to support and help and collaborate on assisting that survivor toward their goals. And then kind of tangentially speaking, we also have a broadening the scope conversation we're having around, again, there are these specific DV, trauma, EJ conversations we're having, but then they're also part of a larger conversation around systemic issues and oppression that exist within our community. So we're exploring and interested in hearing from you all around other intersections with economic justice you might be interested in. And so some topics that we're already at are DV housing and oppression, and then money, DV, and oppression. But specifically, in a few weeks, we will be having the follow-up conversation to this presentation, which will mainly focus on that deeper dive with implementation tools and identifying community partnerships that are meaningful and supportive. So I will turn it over to questions. I know there's some announcements, and I also have our contact info on the next slide as well, so we can play it by ear from here for what you all need.
So if you all have any questions for Chance about this kind of introduction to the EJ Pocket Guide and all of the different layers, feel free to type those in the chat. And also, again, the next part will be, getting kind of digging into the implementation. It looks like there is a question in the chat. Since I'm chatting, I will read it aloud. It says, I work in Elbert County, and there's no shelter or motel or anything for victims. Chance, do you want to address that when there's minimal resources in a community or no resources?
Sorry, I was having trouble getting my mute button off of there. So yeah, this is actually, I mean, I don't have any immediate, so I might ask Lindsay to jump on if she's around, but I do want to highlight that the lack of transportation, the lack of housing, all these conversations are also how Lindsay and I started to begin to bridge these gaps around if there's no shelters, then again, how do we get survivors into housing? What does rental assistance look like? Are there other programs that can assist survivors in attaining housing and shelter and getting that need met if the traditional route and means of shelter is not there?
Yeah, I think this is actually something that we had planned to dive into a little bit deeper in our follow-up webinar that I did just put the link into the chat box for. But I think this speaks to what Chance had mentioned around who are your partners in this work, and using kind of the public will building strategy that Chance is really the expert on, of identifying, you know, if there isn't a shelter or a motel in your area that you're able to work with survivors, how do you start those relationships, or how do you look to see what other programs or other folks in the community can offer? So how do you bring to them your perspective and your expertise in the DV side of things with survivors, knowing that without shelter, without housing, it is harder to achieve these other pieces of stability. So we're really speaking here to the intersections of these different things. And I, like Chance, don't have an immediate solution, but I would say it starts with identifying what options can you begin to build in your community. And I will add, it's really difficult without funding, especially without flexible funding, where you're able to meet what Chance was referencing as that crisis need, that immediate need to stabilize folks a bit in that crisis moment, to get them to a point where they can even conceptualize and start to think about the bigger picture or other pieces of that.
Are there other questions for Chance and Lindsay? And the link is in the chat, and you can go ahead and register now to get a spot in that next layer of conversation. I'm also going to go ahead and put a link to the survey for this webinar, just so that you all have that. If you wouldn't mind helping us out and completing the survey, that helps us also know what are some other topics that you're interested in hearing about in our monthly webinars. And as we're kind of holding space, if you come up with other questions, oh, we do have a question. Will part 2 dive more into flex funding implementation? Great question.
I think it will definitely come up. I think part of it will depend on if folks there have specific flexible or flexible-ish funding sources that they already know that they're working with, or if it's just a matter of identifying more flexible opportunities. Will probably determine what that might mean and look like for the larger group conversation. But also, we're always happy to connect and support on some of those deeper conversations as well as a team. So feel free to reach out if you are interested in learning more before or after that as well.
That was just what I was going to add. I'd say that we created this PowerPoint from a really broad perspective in hopes that it would be more applicable to more folks, and also knowing that implementation or infusing some of these components is going to take additional conversation, and it'll look different for every organization or every agency. So the idea would be we're starting broad and getting a bit more narrow as we dive into some of these additional conversations. But again, like Chance mentioned, we would be happy to have a conversation one-on-one with folks. I will say with flex funding, There will be more to come this year in terms of training opportunities, but again, we don't have to wait for that opportunity to come up. We're happy to schedule something and chat with you more about that. Flex funding definitely increases what programs advocates can offer to survivors, in the sense that you are able to say yes more often. You're able to provide financial assistance for a wider array of things. You're not working with eligibility requirements around the funding stream. So definitely needed, and it definitely supports economic justice work in the idea that it is survivor driven, survivor determined, and you are not working within like federal or foundation regulations.
It looks like we have, looks like Katie Falsetto has their hand raised. Katie, do you want to type in the chat, or I can go ahead and unmute you? I'm going to go ahead and do that. If you prefer to type in the chat, just let me know. You are unmuted. If you want to unmute yourself, you should be able to.
No, I just wanted to say thanks. It's so hard to get to be able to learn how to help people that are experiencing financial abuse. And I really appreciate you guys doing those presentations for us.
Thanks so much, Katie. Does anybody else have questions?
Sorry, Brandy.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add that step 2 will be a deeper dive into some of the tools that we use to create the handbook. Just Katie, speaking to what you said, sometimes it's hard to identify things that will support survivors in terms of financial abuse. So we will have a deeper look or deeper dive into some of the tools. So like an intake screening form with questions that you could use, other resources such as the All-State Moving Ahead curriculum, and those will be woven into that next conversation as well. So just again, making a plug for part 2, and it will be recorded. So for folks who aren't able to make it to part 2 live, we will share the recording with folks so that you have access to that as well.
That's great. Well, are there any other questions that folks might have for Chance and Lindsay? Again, we'll leave that open. One other piece of information I'd like to share with you all is that we do have our monthly Facts and Snacks webinar. Occurs on every second Tuesday of the month. However, in September, we are actually not going to be holding the Facts and Snacks webinar. We're hoping to get this information out by the end of this week or the beginning of next week. But instead of doing our regular Facts and Snacks, which would have been on September 14th, we are actually going to be hosting during September 2 different webinars about confidentiality. So I want you all to keep an eye out for that, just to be on the lookout, because we will have one webinar about confidentiality that's specific to technology, and especially how things are, how services have been impacted during COVID, as well as now that we're transitioning out and in of COVID again. Depending upon where you're located as well. But so one webinar is going to deal with more of the tech piece, and then another webinar on confidentiality is going to deal with different roles in organizations and how confidentiality is important, how to maintain that, what are some of the boundaries and things that are necessary when there's different roles within an organization. So be on the lookout for the announcements and registration for both of those webinars, and just know we'll go back to our regular Facts and Snacks schedule. That will be in October. So that would be October 12th. So thank you all, and definitely reach out if you have questions about any of those webinars, as well as reaching out to both Chance and Lindsay if you have questions specific to economic justice, specific to flexible funding. There's a lot of good information out there, and I know it can be overwhelming when you're trying to sift through everything. So thank you all for being here. I don't see any other questions. Chance and Lindsay, do you have any other last things that you'd like to do to wrap up?
I do not. Just thank you, everyone, and thank you for your kind words. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you on the 24th.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you all, and we hope you all have a great afternoon, ending a little early for our facts and snacks, so you guys can have a quick 20 minutes to yourself, catch, breathe, have your own grounding, and we really appreciate you all. Thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.